I want to be clear about something before I begin this morning, that in fact I'm still considering myself to be preaching this morning. Preaching for me is a passion that I have, but I'll be doing it in such a way that I'm providing you with some information in a different kind of way. My guess is we did not see it coming. Or did we? A great question, I believe, for those of us who live in what we call church land. So this morning I want to share with you some of my own experience over the last few years in trying to get a handle on the spiritual landscape that we now find ourselves living in that has changed our complete world. I don't just mean our complete world here in Kingston, Ontario. I mean the entire world landscape. It's certainly different from my understanding of it, and it calls us out to pay attention as we wallow in our grief, which is valid, about how things used to be. It's always important to grieve, because unless we grieve, we can never move on. So it's important to take the time to do so. But, as I've often believed for some time, we struggle from what I often refer to as the edifice complex. So let me ask you this question. If, and I say if, the two churches, Chalmers and Sydenham Street, were to become suddenly condemned, or perhaps you arrived on a Sunday morning and they had fallen down, would you seriously, knowing what you know in the 21st century now, with the landscape that we live in, would you seriously rebuild the exact same thing that you currently have? Let me share with you this modern-day parable. On a dangerous seacoast where shipwrecks often occurred, there was once a crude little life-saving station. The building was just a hut, and there was only one boat. But the few devoted members kept a constant watch over the sea, and with no thought of themselves went out day and night tirelessly to find the lost ones. Some of those who were saved and various others in the surrounding area wanted to become associated with that life-saving station and give of their time and of their money and of their effort for their support of its work. New boats were bought and new crews were trained, and the little life-saving station grew. Now, some of the members of the life-saving station were very unhappy that the building was so crude and poorly equipped. They felt that a more comfortable place should be provided as the first refuge of those who are saved from the sea. So they replaced the emergency cots with beds and put better furniture in their enlarged building. And now the life-saving station became a popular gathering place for its members. And they decorated it beautifully, and they furnished it exquisitely, because they used it as a sort of club. Fewer members were now interested in going to sea on life-saving missions, so they hired lifeboat crews to do this work. The life-saving motif still prevailed in this club's decoration, and there was a liturgical lifeboat in the room where the club initiations were held. At this time, a large ship was wrecked off the coast, and the hired crews in boatloads of cold, wet, and half-drowned people. They were dirty and they were sick, and some of them had black skin and some of them had yellow skin. The beautiful new club was suddenly in chaos. So the property committee immediately had a shower house built outside the club where victims of shipwrecks could be cleaned up before being allowed inside. Now, at the next meeting, there was a split in the club membership. Most of the members wanted to stop the club's life-saving activities as being unpleasant and a hindrance to the normal social life of their club. Some members insisted upon life-saving as their primary purpose and pointed out that they were still called a life-saving station. But they were finally voted down and told that if they wanted to save the lives of the various kinds of people who were shipwrecked in those waters, they should begin their own life-saving station down the coast. And so they did. As the years went by, the new station that was built experienced the same changes that had occurred in the old one. It evolved into a club, and yet another life-saving station was found. History continued to repeat itself, and if you visit that seacoast today, you will find a great number of exclusive clubs along the shore. Shipwrecks are frequent in those waters, but most of the people drown. I had the great privilege of being one of 100 people in 2013 to be chosen to go over to the Greenbelt Festival in Britain. What most people would never have known is that I was on the brink in that year of probably considering leaving the church. That's just where I was. I'm not blaming anybody for it. That's just where I found myself at that time in my life. The Greenbelt Festival, if you don't know anything about it, make sure when you go home you Google it. Arrived there. There was 100 of us, and Bruce was there. Bruce, where are you? Bruce was there. A lot of clergy there. And part of our mission was to go there to experience this thing that had been going on, which was predominantly started as a Christian festival in 1974, to get a sense of the landscape of what was going on over there with this festival, because there was a heck of a lot going on in the way spirituality was getting lived out and expressed. And the great part of it is that in Britain, of course, where most churches, in case you don't know, have closed, or in the ones that are still open, the very old ones, far older than Sydenham Street and Chalmers, they don't even have those things in them anymore. They've taken them out. The pews are out to create more usable space instead of having it as dead space. I was there, and there were over 20,000 people at this, what was it, 4 or 5 days? Bruce, remind me. 5 days, 5-day event. There was every faith group from around the world, including people who were atheists or of no faith at all, that were gathered at this festival. It was magnanimous. Workshops everywhere, different kinds of music everywhere, everybody talking to each other. And they were from all over the world. It was as if the world had gathered in one place in brotherly and sisterly love with all the differences you can imagine, and were able to share their stories about what they were doing in their local communities. So what I did, and I had made the decision before I went there, that I was going to take time in my time there to at least, if I could, conduct a short interview with between 20 and 30 people who were under the age of 35. My first question was, do you belong to a church or have you been raised in a church? Most of them, probably 80% of them, had never been a part of a church. Those who had left because they didn't want anything more to do with the institutional model of church. They no longer trusted it. But here's some of what was going on the ground. These people were deeply and profoundly spiritual in every single way. Some of them would gather 2 or 3 times a week to bake bread. Their ministry was to bake bread and then to go out in the street and to feed those who were on the street. Some of them would also take time in that kind of group where they would gather either once a week or once a month in somebody's home for some spiritual refreshment. They would use scripture or whatever the readings were that they wanted to use that day to kind of lift themselves up and give themselves some strength and remind themselves of the story of a people of God so that they could go out on a weekly basis and carry out their ministry. All of them wanted nothing to do, every one of them, and I'm not making this up. I mean, I can't bring them in here to substantiate what I'm saying, but I'm telling you, all of them wanted nothing to do with having to take money out of their pockets to keep a building going. For those who were Christian, they believed that the model of living was to be out there, encountering the people who are out there, and to make the world a better place to live in. Now, that's not to say that we as churches and for faith communities, we don't try and work to make the world a better place to live in. We do. But we do it in a different kind of way. There were other people that what they do is they formed little organizations amongst themselves, and they gather on a weekly basis for spiritual refreshment, and then they go out and they go into nursing homes and help in nursing homes. They go out to playgrounds, children's playgrounds, and they fix children's playgrounds. They define themselves with a particular ministry, and they go and do it. And that particular network was coming up from the United States out of California, and it was in 2014 I discovered there were a couple of those groups that were now in Toronto. One of them is now living in a house beside a United Church up north of Mississauga. And they're connected to a United Church congregation up there, although they don't worship with the congregation. They just rent the house that they're in so that they can live together. They're living together in community. In my 5 days of being at Greenbelt and returning home with all that I experienced, I finally had hope that there was something really going on in the world in a different kind of way, in a new kind of way that was refreshing and was transformative. And I didn't have any problem at all with anybody saying to me, I don't trust the institution. Because for some of them, they had good reason not to trust the institution. Greenbelt, a festival of arts, faith, and justice. I would encourage you, go to the one that's happening in 2019. In a world that's changing, how should the church change to reach more, not fewer people? The struggle we have is likely the struggle that most churches have. Reaching new people seems to be getting harder and harder every year. What if it didn't have to be that way, I ask you? What if it became easier and easier? So here's a big idea. Right now, we're in the greatest communication revolution since 1440 with the invention of movable type with the Gutenberg press. As more than a few observers have said, with the explosion of audiobooks and podcasting, we're currently in the middle of a shift in which listening is emerging as the new reading. While Gutenberg opened up reading to people who had never had the means or the opportunity to read before, audio listening or audio books, and especially podcasting, is breaking down an even more massive barrier. Listening likely has the potential to be as big, if not bigger, than reading, because people who are illiterate don't always take the time to read. Many people, especially non-reading men, are discovering that listening to books and podcasts are very doable. In a recent survey about Americans, they found that and they determined that podcasting is for the young. 85% of its listeners are under 55. 56% of its listeners are men who generally are harder for church leaders to get out to church than women. The The fastest growing demographic in this group is among people aged 29 to 54, with 29% year-over-year growth in listenership. 85% of podcast listeners have at least a college education. Podcast listeners have an average income of $75,000 a year or more. Think about it. Many people with routine jobs, long commutes, and set exercise routines have time to kill, and they're doing it, binge listening to podcasts at the rate of 12 hours listening per week, or in fact more. All of which have so much potential for churches. A potential which, frankly, almost everyone is missing. I know that to reach 25-year-olds who are not in church, guess what? Most of them have earbuds in. We think they don't listen for very long. They listen for hours to things. Oh, by the way, who has a cell phone? Let me see it. Let me see your cell phone. No, let me see your cell phone. Have you got it with you here? Hold it up. All right. That thing you have there is the equivalent of the new narthex, or the new entryway into a church. Because what we need to know is that most people today, before they ever go anywhere, and I'm one of those people, the first place I go to is I go to their website. And the website will tell me as much as I need to know as to whether I want to go to that place or not. I'm not just talking about churches, I'm talking about businesses, whatever it might be. That is your new hall, narthex, whatever you want to call it. And most listeners, new ones who show up on a Sunday morning today, will have already checked out the website to determine whether they're coming here or not. There might be something they find on that website that says, I need to go there physically now to check that out. That's something for us to pay attention to. The website. Every year, it needs to be changed. You know that line about humans having the attention span of a goldfish? The shorter the message, the better it is. Well, the studies have in fact shown that that is not the case at all. That is not true. It's not even universally true. Because over the last few years, the raw data that has come back, that the content that is now being listened to through podcasts, etc., has become the dominant form of consumption among younger adults who live in North America. And yes, people have much longer attention spans than the mainstream media thinks they have. You see what I'm saying? We need to move beyond church in a box. That's a remnant from a day when everything was done at a set clock. You know, you sat down on Thursday night at 8 o'clock to watch your favorite show because you didn't want to miss it. Of course, for years, nobody has watched any show at a set time unless it's a live game or a live event now. Everything else is watched on demand, or it's watched on stream with live streaming. Shopping happens on your cell phone 24 hours a day, not during the set hours of a physical store that has limited stock. Streaming has changed how we listen to music. You don't own music anymore. You rent access to anything, anytime, anywhere. And yet in the church, we want to perpetuate a model that says we have 1, 2, 3 services on Sunday. We do midweek X. The cultural change has been underway for decades, but the church has been very slow to adapt. For years, we have noticed that even committed Christians, imagine, committed Christians are attending church less. So what does better engagement beyond a set time and a place on a Sunday look like? Well, part of it is the cell phone. It's the new entryway. It's quite possible that it'll take a few weeks for people to observe what's happening on the website. Maybe a month before they make a final determination whether they wish to show up here or not. What I find interesting with all that I've learned, and I could take hours to share with you what I've learned in my time in Toronto and some of the work that I've been about, and what I'm seeing happening with faith communities in Toronto in profound ways, which are radically different than you've ever experienced in church, is then I come upon this wonderful passage of Isaiah. You know Isaiah. That's that part in the Old Testament that you and I have connected ourselves to for a number of years. We listen to it, we hear it. Well, Isaiah had precisely the same problem with his fellow Israelite Babylonian exiles. They remembered their past all too well, that past with Yahweh their God, when they had passed through the waters of the Sea of Reeds an eon ago. Yahweh had been with them. When they had crossed over the river Jordan so many generations ago, Yahweh had been with them. When fire and flame had threatened them in the desert of Sinai, and especially when out of a flaming bush had come the word, Yahweh had been with them. And the promise continued of Yahweh. Our God, our Holy One, our Creator, is the God of the new thing. If we expect this Holy One always to act in the ways that we expect, based on our memories, based on what we have experienced before, we will run into the terrible risk of missing what God is up to now. Don't we see it? For God's sakes, don't we see it? This new thing of God that's trying to give birth to new life. And too often we must answer, no. In fact, I think what we say is not no. We say, no, we don't want to see it. We're too busy doing things in the old way, the tried and the true way, the familiar way, the comfortable way, the way that we know and trust. But this God of Isaiah is calling you and I to a new way. And you know what? We can get in the way of it all we want. We won't stop it. The landscape has changed. It's not a question of whether I like it or not. I'm trying to live in the present and the future, not in the past. I wonder. I ask myself this question every day as I walk and talk and live and breathe in the ministry of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Can we trust enough? Can we trust enough that something new can happen? May it be so for you. May it be so for me.